Today is December 27th, 2021, and my guest is Gregory Zuckerman of the Wall Street Journal. He was here on the program in June of 2014 to talk about his book, The Frackers. His latest book is A Shot to Save the World, the inside story of the life or death race for a COVID-19 vaccine, which is our topic for today. Greg, welcome back to EconTalk.
Hey, Russ, great to be back.
So this is an inside story. There's a cast of characters at the different companies and government officials. It's an amazing network of folks, some of whom end up communicating with each other at various times in the scientific process. It takes place actually over decades to get us where we are today, which is a wonderful moment relative to the alternative. I'm curious about the inside story. How did you get the details that you reveal in the book about conversations and the moods? How many interviews did you have to do for this? And how'd you get access to these people?
That's a good question. So early on in the crisis, I made a bet, much like the government ended up making a bet on various vaccine companies. I decided to track a certain number of them, and there were those that were in the lead. There were those that were most intriguing. There were those that people in the field thought had the best chance of success. So once I made those decisions, they didn't all work out, but most of them did. I tried, my challenge was to get inside the efforts, and some were easier than others. Generally speaking, academics are the most eager to speak. Government officials are almost as eager. Once you get through the PR people, those kinds of people, you get Fauci and his team on the phone. They're very generous with their time and open. And then corporate efforts are harder and they take much more effort. And then some are even much more difficult. Usually it's a reflection of the personality. So the University of Oxford was a really difficult one. And partly because those that lead it are difficult people. So there was a degree of various degrees of difficulty in terms of breaking inside. And what I do, I'm an investigative journalist. That's what I do at the Wall Street Journal. And my task is to get people to open up and speak, often when they probably, I wouldn't say shouldn't, often when there are incentives for them not to speak. So, and my job is to present an argument as to why it's in their best interest to speak. And yes, I'm talking my book, literally, but I do think this is a historic effort, and it's in their interest to contribute and make sure that the record is accurate. And that's my argument often with people.
So a lot of those conversations were not the participants at Moderna or BioNTech or J&J or Oxford or Novavax or, I'm missing one, Pfizer. Those aren't people retrospectively 2-3 years later, or year and a half, say, later, remembering what happened. You're keeping track of them and confirming and trying to make them feel comfortable that you're not going to reveal this until the book comes out?
Right. So a lot of it was real time, more so than I've ever done in my life. What I often do, I've written a number of books. I write about big successes, and I look back and describe how they occurred. And as you suggest, this one, it was more of a real-time effort. And yeah, listen, frankly, some people are eager to speak about the drama behind the scenes, their role, and it's my job to make sure it's accurate. So then what I do is check it with others, make sure it's accurate, et cetera. That's sort of part of what the challenge. Yeah.
So, spoiler alert, we get some vaccines out of this, but I have to say what makes it an extraordinary book is that you start going back in history. You talk about some of the challenges, the AIDS vaccine, and then we're into the 2000s, and then we're into the 2010s. And the reader knows how the story turns out, but it doesn't look possible in 2018. I mean, forget 2012. In 2018, the companies that we now look to as these great success stories it's not like, well, they were close. They had nothing. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about. But I thought the drama and the poignance of the book, part of it comes from the fact that even though we know how it turns out, it was certainly not a foregone conclusion.
Right. That was my goal writing this thing, to present that history, and I do so because it's important to understand. It's my way of, it's a conceit to describe the immune system, describe the evolution of some of these vaccine approaches. But I also am trying to plant a seed in the reader or the listener, if you listen to the audio. I want to make it clear how challenging it is to develop vaccines and how many efforts failed along the way, which makes it all the more remarkable, this achievement. Had I started with, let's say, 2018 or 2019 and dove right into it, it would be impressive what they accomplished, but not as impressive as if you compare it with all the string of failures over the years. Also, frankly, when I was doing the research, I kept hearing about AIDS vaccines, the work we did on AIDS, Greg, what we learned from AIDS. And I'm an outsider. I'm not a science writer. I'm an investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I do different industries, mostly financial. I'm from the world of finance. And my assumption was going into this thing that AIDS vaccine, the effort was an utter failure. And I learned along the way how much was actually learned and developed and applied to COVID-19. And I thought that would be important for the reader to understand as well.
I think the other thing you learned from this book, and I want to talk, a little bit about this backstory and these undercurrents before we get to the main entree. I've been in academics for 3+ decades. I guess almost 4 now, if you think of it as 4, 4+. It's a really petty, peculiar world, and I think it's more so in science. I've been an economist my whole professional career. These are not economists. These are not social scientists. These are hardcore chemists, biochemists, epidemiologists, scientists, and they are peculiar people. And I think we have this idea of them sitting in the lab, standing. They're standing, by the way, often. They're standing in the lab. They're in their lab coat. They're staring at a beaker. They're staring at a pipette. They're poring over something growing in a petri dish with a microscope. They're looking off in the distance, thinking deep thoughts. What your book reveals is that an enormous portion of their time, and I don't think this is melodrama, I think it's real, they're incredibly stressed out because they're afraid they're going to be scooped by a rival. They're afraid they're not going to get the glory they deserve. There's an amazing amount of competitive passion in this world that I think outsiders don't appreciate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I know that's right because I was an outsider, and that was my presumption as well about these people, these individuals. They were data-oriented and focused and unemotional, and they were anything but unemotional. They're, as you say, petty, they're competitive, they're neurotic, they're ambitious, the level of competition was striking. And partly I write this book to introduce the reader to this world and to inform them of how science is, and frankly, how breakthroughs are developed. And I had this naive assumption that the scientific breakthroughs are some brilliant individual in some basement lab, some eureka moment. And the other thing that really struck me is how it's a team orientation. It's almost like a relay race where you have groups of people running and making progress and then stumbling and falling and passing the baton to the next group. And that struck me as well. So right there, and thank God for all these the characteristics of these and traits of these scientists, because as a writer, I went into this thinking I was a little wary that there wouldn't be the characters that I need to write a compelling book. And I couldn't have been more surprised by what I discovered. Yes.
And they're deeply vulnerable, damaged.
Damage is a good word.
So much heartbreak for the people. You say pass the baton. They kind of drop the baton after they fall down, and someone else sees it laying there and says, "Oh, I guess I'll run for a while with it." It's a shockingly intense world. Again, we think of academic life as sort of not so stressful. You teach some classes, you have some research. These people, they're they're not in the academic world, they're in the corporate world, most of them. They're scientists, though. And as scientists in the corporate world doing effectively academic work for profit, they are driven and damaged.
Yeah, it's a great observation. It was one that I was struck by. And I understand why. It's a competitive world. You spend years making incremental progress, potentially, hopefully, and then often it's a dead end. And there's somebody out there or more than one person out there working on the same thing. So you become neurotic. And the other thing that jumped out at me, and I was naive about, is the importance of the role of money in this world. And I thought, okay, you get a grant, you're an academic researcher, and you've got some money, and you're good to go. It's almost like a congressman where, yeah, you raised money, but you're thinking about the next fundraiser right away. And you're thinking about your next grant right away. And will this last? And can I pay for the people in my lab? And are we making enough progress? And how can I show that we're making enough progress to get more money? And the rivalries build, but also the pressure builds. And they're all under remarkable amounts of pressure. And it's impressive what they accomplish and how they deal with this. But it was important for me to shed light on that world as well.
I want to add one more lesson. There'll be others, but one more lesson before we go more deeply into vaccines that I learned from the book. There's an immense amount of what I would call tinkering. I think when we think of science, we think of you put a bunch of equations on the board and you work it out, and then you test it and it works or it doesn't work and you go on. A lot of this is it's equivalent to what we talked about with Matt Ridley when we talked about innovation. Some of the skill in this is it's obviously luck. There's an enormous amount of luck. There's an enormous amount of trial and error of developing pieces that aren't really what we would normally think of as science. It's more like repairing a car or solving a problem of a repair in your basement or your backyard, where you're not sure what's going to work. You don't know if it's going to work, and you try something, and you're throwing a lot of things against the wall. And I think when we think of, chemistry from, say, high school or medicine, we assume it works more like a recipe, and they're trying to figure out the recipe, and they don't have any idea what the ingredients. They have some big picture idea, but in the weeds, it's really a lot of trial and error.
Yes, it is. And it's incremental advances. You hope to have incremental advances. And it's going down dead ends. And frankly, I do what I do for a living, partly because I like to turn things around, be it on a daily basis at the Wall Street Journal, or, I work on a piece, for a week, maybe, or a few weeks, maybe a few months, hypothetically, but that's rare. And my books, okay, I'll spend this one, it was about a year and a half devoted, and it's all consuming, but then it's out. I can show it to the world. These guys, they spent years. They spent literally years on an approach that may not work. And I, on a selfish level, I learned from them the patience, the resilience, the persistence. It's admirable.
Yeah, the uncertainty about it is part of what I'm talking about. And they have a lot of passion for their approach. There were all kinds of different approaches that were tried to develop this vaccine and other medical challenges. And people become passionate about their horse in that race. But the truth is, of course they are. It's theirs. They don't really have more than an intuition, it seems, about whether it's going to come across the finish line or not and make it.
Yeah, that's very true. And I found the distinction interesting between the leader of the lab, who has various postdocs and others working for him or her. And in some ways, it's a portfolio approach. They all describe it that way, where you have a bunch of people working for you. And if any one of them has a breakthrough, writes a good paper, that's good for you. And a few of them are going to fail. But that younger academic has that one approach, and there's no portfolio approach there. It's just all in on something, and it may not work, and you may not have a paper. And if you don't have a paper, you can't get a job. You can't get a job. You're stuck. And the pressures build, and it goes on for years. And yeah, I'm glad we frankly talked about this, because I've done different interviews, but there haven't been any that really have delved into this world. And I think it's important for people to understand. It's entertaining. It's interesting to understand this world, but it's important as well. It's an important part of science.
Yeah, it's intense, which is as your subtitle says, it is life or death. It's really not just like. The joke is academics are petty because the stakes are so small. The stakes here couldn't have been bigger. And, obviously the participants wanted to change the world and make it better, but they wanted to change the world. They wanted to be the ones, not just, I'm sure they were happy that other people were successful, but you kind of felt like they definitely wanted to be there first.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what your impression was of the characters in my book. I think one comes away impressed, obviously, and you thankful. But I don't know. Are there people you really want to have a cup of coffee with, have a beer with? I'm not so sure. They're not. I'm not a big believer in black and white characters. I love the gray. And you have a lot of gray here. So in other words, motivations. Yeah, they want to save lives, but do they want to get rich and famous too? Many of them, yeah. Do they have some mixed kind of, they want the recognition of their peers? That's hugely important, maybe more important than rich and famous. So there are all kinds of interesting mixed emotions. And frankly, they take steps sometimes. They're so competitive. Sometimes how they react to each other is not admirable. There are a few people I mentioned in my book, as if you recall, Adrian Hill, just really difficult on his peers, difficult on others, very, very critical. So these are academics that spend years getting up in meetings and ripping into each other. And again, there's mixed emotions. They believe their approach is going to save lives, and they want to save lives, but they also want to be the ones to do it.
They're also just, as we all are, they're flawed human beings, and their ability to subdue some of the less attractive sides of themselves are, of course, imperfect. I was struck by the CEO of Moderna, which one of the things, the coolest things, very small thing, but a cool thing I learned in the book is Moderna is modified RNA, which is just really cool for a name, and it's modern, which is also cool. But the CEO is Stefan, right? Stefan Bancel reminds the reader inevitably of Steve Jobs. Not just, I think he's got a turtleneck issue, but it's not. That's not the reason. The reason I was fascinated by that is that he has boundless optimism most of the time, at least in public, and he's very demanding and very difficult to work with, and yet people want to work with him. Which, when Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs came out, people said, "Well, turns out Steve, what'd you learn from the book?" I would ask, "Oh, Steve Jobs is a jerk." Okay, that's not interesting. So I had to read the book for a while. That's not what the book's about. Part of the book is about Steve Jobs is a jerk, but it's more interesting that he was a difficult person. And I don't want to call him a jerk. That's not nice. But he was a difficult person for sure. But that didn't stop people from making enormous personal sacrifices to earn his respect. And that comes through a number of the characters in your book where, people are driven and drive their employees to work 25/8 for the company, and people keep doing it. Obviously there's a leadership factor there that is, it's easy to dismiss these people as tyrants, which they have a tyrannical aspect to them, but they also change the world because they are able to lead a team to exceed what they are probably capable of under someone else.
Yeah, Russ, that's exactly right. And it also, that raises the question, do you need these types of personalities to have these remarkable breakthroughs? And yes, Stefan Bancel is goes back to that theme of you're not sure if you like him or not. I think I can't speak for the readers, but he is difficult on his underlings, has always been. He pushes them. They were early on at Moderna. People were collapsing at the office, in the parking lot, hitting their heads, at home, being rushed to ambulances to the hospital because he pushed them so hard, and they were trying to keep up with him. And he fired people quickly and easily. Could be very insulting, and yet inspiring. And if you talk to people today within the company, and I do, they love the guy. And you say to yourself, well, how do you love a guy who's so hard on? Well, he's also he's a great leader. He inspires. He's the one who said a few years ago, he said to people within Moderna, and I write about it, obviously, all in the book, we're going to be the ones to step up and save lives in a crisis. And that's inspirational. And people love him. And it takes time, I think, as an executive to build a team that understands you and isn't insulted by those kinds of comments. And now the people within the firm, they love him and within the company. It took a little while. But right, well, he's one of these complex characters.
He's easier to love now probably than he was before. But
yes,
I mean, obviously there are tough bosses who bring out the best in you, and there's a certain type of person who wants to have that boot camp-like demand put on them for their own aspiration. Other people want to just not deal with that. I get, obviously I'm not criticizing him. He's a complicated person. But that's all my point is he's a complicated person. I think some of the exterior of these people like him and Jobs and others, they bring out something in people that others, as I said, others can't bring out.
I think that's true. I think that's true.
It's not for everybody.
And also, I think on the outside, if I can speak for my fellow journalists, we adopt sometimes. There's a simple narrative, especially about Stefan Bancel. And early on, there's a lot of talk about him being a jerk. So we all view him as a jerk. And I don't think it's appropriate because you need to do the research and realize he's the most giving friend I've ever encountered. Like to people that in his circle, he literally writes notes, like notes of appreciation to his friends. And he was reaching out to friends during 2020. I had no time. I don't know about you. I was crazed and worried about the future and writing this book and keeping my job and stressed out. And he was saving the world. And yet he was taking time to ask friends who had lost their job if he can help them. Zoom calls where he was generous with his friends. So he's a very, as you said, complicated character, which I love. I love that great character.
Yeah. It's part of the charm of the book for sure. Let's get into the science. We're at a really extraordinary moment in medicine and biochemistry that at least the two of the most successful vaccines, Moderna's and BioNTech, that was developed eventually with Pfizer, produced by Pfizer, they used a radical technique that was brand new and was, as you suggested a minute ago, and it comes through in the book overwhelmingly, there was never certainty that it was going to work. There are people who believed in it. There are people who were, cheerful and optimistic, and as the day is long, that of course it's going to work. But of course we all had doubts in the privacy of our own home about those kind of stories, even when we were telling them sometimes. So let's start with the way vaccines used to work. When we think about traditional vaccination, whether it's smallpox, polio, what was the idea? How did that work?
Sure. So every vaccine is an education. We're teaching the immune system to recognize and prepare for some pathogen, some illness, some virus. And traditionally, you do that by introducing a piece of that pathogen. And we call it attenuated or killed. Basically, it's either a watered down with formaldehyde or kills version of a piece of the actual virus. So right, traditionally the vaccines introduce the actual virus to the body. And obviously it's not dangerous because it's either been weakened or killed, that piece of the virus.
That's in modern times. Of course, in earlier times, there were folk remedies. The first vaccines, in quotes, where they went and got yourself sick a little bit, not too much. And you probably made a mistake every once in a while. Crazy idea, by the way. Horrible idea. Really a radical, bizarro idea. You want to protect yourself from smallpox? Give yourself some. Like, really?
It's true. Now you mention it, right? Who would even think about doing that? And, talk about trial and error. It took us a lot of years to figure that out, that approach. But that's the same point where we're educating the immune system. Please recognize we're going to introduce this piece of the virus, and so that the next time you actually encounter the real thing, not a weakened or killed version of it, you'll be prepared and ready to fight it off. And that was always the traditional approach. Sabin, Salk, all the famous vaccinologists, the Merck famous ones, MMR, we all recognize. But over time, we realized that, well, it's not always the best approach. Let's say with AIDS, you really don't want to introduce a piece of that kind of virus. It's so dangerous and harmful. And others as well, it's not ideal necessarily. And also it just takes a while, really long time to manufacture those kinds of vaccines. They're challenging in a lot of ways to develop.
And just to be clear, you'd think that's a bad strategy. But the reason it's a good strategy, if I understood what you said in the book correctly, is that the body needs some time. And if you just introduce the smallpox as a full-blown version, your body doesn't react quickly enough. The idea of the vaccine is to prep the defense forces to be ready to recognize it more quickly, correct? Because you've got the same ammunition to fight the smallpox when it comes in its full-blown version. It's just that you needed a practice run, right?
Yes. Yeah,
that's
exactly.
really what's going on. It's the timing. Yes. Is that right?
Yeah, and also listen, frankly, some bodies are better capable than others of fighting off the actual pathogen, even cancer. Many of us encounter and fight off, but not everybody is able to. So it needs that education, that dry run, as it were. But over time, we realized that there could be other approaches. And mRNA, should I dive into mRNA as that approach?
Please.
Yeah, so mRNA was always the kind of holy grail. It was the dream of scientists. And I'll just kind of take a step back and just explain what the heck that is. So basically, messenger RNA is a molecule. We all have it inside of us naturally. Its job is to transport the genetic messages from DNA to the part of the cell where proteins are created, proteins that keep us alive. And messenger RNA does that job. DNA can't do it itself. It relies on messenger RNA. And mRNA is a very short-lived molecule. In other words, it gets chopped up by enzymes in the cell almost immediately. So it's a very short-lived kind of molecule. And the scientists always said, wait, hold on a second. Messenger RNA transports these messages. It creates proteins, every kind of protein. What if we could develop these in the lab synthetically, just sort of like you have sugar, you have natural sugar, we have artificial sugar. Maybe we could create artificial mRNAs. And why was that the holy grail? Why was that the goal of scientists for decades? Because if you can send a message into the body to create any protein, any specific protein, then you can turn the body into a lab of its own, a factory of its own. You can create any kind of drug or vaccine within the body naturally, quickly, efficiently. So in other words, you just send a message. So you want a protein? Good. Let's go get it. Here, I'm going to send a message to the body through a vaccine or a drug, a therapeutics, to create any kind of protein, which again is the key for any kind of drug or vaccine. And just as quickly as scientists got excited about that approach, that idea, they usually gave up on the idea because, on paper, it makes sense. I can create a vaccine to send a message, this mRNA to send a message to the body to create a protein, and we're off to the races. But remember that the mRNA is short-lived. It gets chopped up immediately. So why would I base a drug or a vaccine on something, some molecule that doesn't last? Also, the body has defenses against it. It's built up over the years, and time again, when they tried these experiments, the body fended off these mRNA, these molecules that were created in the lab. So it was always the holy grail, the goal scientists dreamed of. But then most, not all, most kind of said, yeah, right, but forget about it. It's a little bit like going back to that earlier book we talked about, the frackers, where shale was this kind of rock where everyone knew it was packed with oil and gas, but don't waste your time on it. It's too deep, it's too challenging, too expensive. Forget about it. Same kind of thing. Don't waste your time on mRNA was always the conventional wisdom.
Right, and they were right. The conventional wisdom was right for a long time, but it failed over and over again in attempts to implement it in first in mice, right, and in other before you got to humans. But just to clarify one thing about the strategy, the protein you're going to create with this artificial mRNA molecule is going to be a protein that's going to send a signal to the body to fight this other thing. And let's fast forward to this coronavirus. It's usually the sort of hallmark characteristic protein of the virus. So in this case, it's the spike protein. It's something that is a good education for the body's immune system. Oh, it's just a practice run.
Yeah.
It's
so in this case, remember how I say it in the book, how it's like Kim Kardashian's tush and Tom Brady's cleft chin. It's something that is characteristic. It's what you could recognize. The body's immune system sees that protein, knows right away, this is foreign, this is dangerous, I'm going to go attack it. In this case, spike protein. And it was fascinating. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but everybody early in 2020 kind of said, yeah, let's build vaccines built around the spike protein, because that's the key to this. It's how it latches on to the body cells. It's just the key part of this virus. And that's the case of others. With AIDS, there's a protein that has been the basis or was the basis for a lot of the vaccines as well. So you want to introduce a protein that is key to that virus to educate the immune system.
So it's just a two-step maneuver. Instead of introducing the protein into the body, you introduce the mRNA into the body. The protein's the disease. You could give people a little bit of COVID, right, as a way to get their immune system to recognize it. But what the mRNA does is introduce a little small piece of it.
It teaches the body to create it. It sends a message to the body to create that protein. And once it's created, the body recognizes it and is alerted that it's foreign and it's harmful and dangerous. So you're sending a message to the body to create that spike protein. And frankly, it's the mRNA approach, but it's also the J&J and AstraZeneca approach. They just do it in a different way. But those are they're genetic messages to the body.
But they're creating a little piece of the virus to tell the body to fight it. So again, it's the same idea. You're giving it yourself a little bit of it.
Yeah,
but so little that it's not going to hurt you. All it's going to do is knock on the door of the immune system and say, hey, wake up, come get this thing.
Yeah, well, you're not introducing a part of you're teaching the body to develop that protein as opposed to introducing it. The other approach, the third approach in COVID is the protein subunit approach, which is what you're saying, where you introduce the actual protein. That's what Novavax does. GSK and Sanofi are working on one and then that's a more traditional approach. You've got shingles vaccines, HPV, where you introduce the actual a protein in the vaccine, as opposed to mRNA, where you're not introducing the protein, you're teaching the body to develop that protein. You're sending a genetic message to the body to create that protein.
Which is scary, which is really scary, because if you make too much, it would kill you, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that the same idea, the same worry?
Right, I guess, hypothetically, right. But it's not enough to harm the body. And also, it's also important to remember that the mRNA gets chopped up. Remember, I said it momentarily, it still does. So the synthetic version of it is not dangerous because it gets eliminated by the body. And that's why some people will say, oh, I'm worried about mRNA. It's sticking around in my body and changing my, no, it gets chopped up. That's the irony there. That's why scientists never want to work with this thing in the first place, because it's so short-lived.
And so you've got to find a husk or a shell of some kind to get it in there for just enough to survive the assault on it before it can do its work. And when it does its work, it's gone, and the body learns. That's the idea of it.
Right. So there's two components to these vaccines. There's the actual mRNA, the genetic message, and then it needs, as you suggest, to be encased in something. And frankly, that delivery challenge was just as important as developing the mRNA. It needs to be delivered and eventually develop these like lipid nanoparticles, which is like fatty products to encase and accompany the genetic message into the body. And that was itself a scientific challenge. And frankly, it doesn't get enough attention, even by the world of academia, because it was done in corporations, I think. So when you talk to like some of the people in my book, I don't want to say names, leading academics who accomplished a lot, who achieved so much and gave so much, they worked on the mRNA side of things. They're sort of dismissive. They're like, then Moderna figured out delivery. Well, geez, that literally took a decade. So it's a little dismissive, frankly, the work within the corporate labs. In BioNTech also, they had to figure out how to deliver that genetic message. That in itself was a huge challenge.
Yeah, and that's the trial and error part. That's the tinkering thing. They're trying different thicknesses of materials, obviously.
Yep.
Let's talk about the miraculous part of this. So, as I alluded to earlier, it's 2018, it's 2019, and it's late 2019, and there's some rumors that there's this pathogen that's coming out of China, out of the area of Wuhan, and I remember very vividly reading about that and thinking, boy, I'm so glad. I didn't even think I'm so glad. I was going to say, I'm so glad it's far away. I didn't think that. I just thought, I don't need to think about that. It's far away. I don't need to read about it. Don't need to know about it. And these companies were ready for that, even though they had not been successful. They were aware that were a pandemic to come along, they would be prepared to fight it in a way that most companies couldn't, most labs couldn't. Why did they think that? Because here they are, some of them going on for, I think, over a decade with no commercial success. They're trying to create vaccines, which is a really profitless task generally. Very few large pharmaceutical companies are interested in it because there's very little money in it. The reason there's little money in it is that it's not socially acceptable. I think this is the reason to charge large amounts of money for something that protects people from horrible disease, especially if it's en masse, like the whole population. And so they don't put any investment in it. These little firms are working on it, almost as an intellectual curiosity, hoping they'll find something that they'll be able to sell some amount of. They're small in terms of investment, in terms of revenue, zero. Why were they so confident, given that they had virtually no product? And so that's the first question. They were sure, oh yeah, our approach is going to solve it. They had no track record. How'd they do it? Not how'd they do it. Why'd they think it?
Right. So to amplify your question, not only have they never produced anything, these companies or these labs, we're talking Moderna, we're talking BioNTech, we're talking University of Oxford, this Novavax. Not only had they never done anything, by the end of 2019, there was intense skepticism, even accusations surrounding these companies. I mean, Moderna specifically, by end of 2019, people compared them to Theranos, especially Stefan Bancel, that CEO we talked about. There were a lot of similarities to Elizabeth Holmes.
Elizabeth Holmes alleged to be a fraud and a liar.
Yes. Right. So, and Stefan Bancel was mentioned in the same breath. Why? Because there were a lot of similarities. There was reason for the skepticism. They're both great salespeople, very, very persuasive. Stefan Bancel had raised tens of billions of dollars for Moderna, often from what they call tourist investors, not really biotech experts. Some were, but many weren't. Sovereign wealth funds kinds of firms, entities, people with a lot of money on their hands, but maybe not the best expertise. And they never done anything. They're big talkers. They started off as Moderna Therapeutics. They were supposed to do drugs. They were not supposed to do vaccines. The fact that they had to pivot to vaccines raised other questions. Who the heck wants to do vaccines? It's a lot of, no one in the world, a big pharma likes vaccines. It's an awful business. You don't make that much money as you suggest, just so much you can charge. It takes years, and maybe the pathogen goes away. And maybe you take a vaccine once a lifetime or once a year at most, maybe, no, but usually not. Everyone wants to do drugs. Moderna had to pivot away from drugs because mRNA was failing there, and they were always very secretive. There was that talk we mentioned earlier about Stefan Bancel being a jerk as a boss who wants to work there. There were all kinds of suspicions about about Stefan Bancel. He wore those turtlenecks. So did Elizabeth Holmes. It was fascinating. So, and other companies too, I write about. Novavax shares were like at $3. They were running out of cash. So you ask, why were they so confident? Why were the scientists within these companies? Partly it goes back to that characteristic trait of the scientists that they have to be. That by definition, it attracts researchers who believe in their efforts. And frankly, the research on my book has taught me a lesson not to be so dismissive of those kinds of researchers. The stock at $3, and they've been working on something for a decade. And guys like me, Greg Zuckerman, will be like, yeah, you're almost being delisted. Oh, you say you've got some approach that you think's going to work. Well, maybe the lesson is at least to be a little less skeptical. I'm not saying don't be skeptical, but a little less skeptical. The lesson here is that there are researchers all over this world convinced of their approaches. And 9 times out of 10, they're not going to work, but there's that 10th time. And these people were convinced of their approaches, partly just by the nature. And the other point is that they had been developing data, and it was below the radar screen. It wasn't well publicized. It was in animal studies, early animal studies often, but it was enough to convince them. And they were always frustrated. I'm not just talking about Moderna. I'm talking about even the J&J group, Oxford, University of Oxford, et cetera. They often developed vaccines to attack pathogens that went away, Zika and MERS and early coronavirus. So they felt, hey, we actually developed a vaccine that's pretty darn effective. It's not our fault that these pathogens went away. They dissipated. So within their labs, they were like, hey, we created something really good. And everybody else outside is like, really? Show me some approved drug or vaccine. I'm not seeing anything here, guys.
Yeah, no, a point I've made here before, and I think it's worth remembering, especially for people like me who have certain biases, ideologies, whatever you want to call them. I've decried on the program certain favors that pharma gets from government regulation and the way that the United States has organized its healthcare system, which allows, in many situations, basically large pharmaceutical firms to put their hand in the pocket of the taxpayer without the right kind of feedback loops that normally work with customers who are paying for things. And I think that's a bad thing. I think it's been done badly. I don't think they're evil. I think the incentives have been set up in all kinds of complicated ways to make that worthwhile, unfortunately. We have lots of episodes on that. If you want to hear more, or you haven't been a regular listener, you can, we'll put a link up to many of those in this episode's page. But one of the benefits of that system is that there's an enormous number of really smart people who have been drawn into that world to tinker. And the world needed those folks this time. We got a silver lining to the rent-seeking and you could, whatever you want to call the big pharma industrial complex that we have in the United States. It creates an enormous laboratory for innovation. I think we have too much. I think we overpay for what we get. I don't think it's as valuable as what we pay for it. But when this came along, there are a lot of people sitting around at labs who'd gotten PhDs in biochemistry and chemistry who were happy to try out something. And as you say, 9 out of the 10 fail. And that's okay. Only need one to work. So we've got this diverse portfolio, this reserve army of biochemists and innovators and startups that turned out to serve us quite well in this crisis. I'm not saying it was worth it, but I think it probably was. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think it's worth remembering that. It's just an interesting a positive unintended consequence, I think, a positive unintended consequence of the amount of resources we poured into pharma with more mercenary intentions.
So I agree with everything you say, and I want to amplify it or add to it. I'm not going to repeat everything you say. I agree with it, but beyond that, listen, I'm a journalist. We are often very skeptical. I've written skeptical pieces about pharma, big pharma, little pharma, medium pharma, but also biotech specifically. Biotech is full of salespeople and exaggerators. But I do think this episode, this experience, is a reminder of the that with those incentives to get really rich comes backing from billions of dollars of venture capital money, small investors, people writing checks for the hope, just the hope that down the road, maybe someday there'll be some payoff. And frankly, there's no other system out there like the U.S. capitalist system, which creates those incentives. And often it leads to bad players and bad actions, bad actors, but it also leads to these breakthroughs. Only in America could Moderna, and I say this after talking to the executives leading these companies, who are many, if not most, foreign born. They all say, in the BioNTech too, they say there's no way we could have done these breakthroughs without investors in America writing these checks for years on the hopes of someday having a home run and seeing some success. So it's a reminder of the benefits. There are downsides too of that system, but there are a lot of benefits too.
Yeah, BioNTech is a German company, but of course, like most foreign pharmaceutical companies, a lot of their money comes not just from U.S. investors, but from the U.S. sales to U.S. customers via the rather this crazy U.S. medical system we have that subsidizes these companies out of taxpayers' pockets mostly.
And subsidizes the world's drugs, right?
Correct. Correct. Oh, no. Without it, we'd have a very different landscape. I think people forget that conveniently when they tout their own systems, which is, they might be better, they might be worse. I'm in Israel right now. There's so many pluses and many minuses of the Israeli healthcare system relative to the U.S. But if the whole world was organized like Israel or Britain, we'd have fewer drugs. We'd have fewer medical devices. Maybe not a lot fewer. That's a debate. Reasonable people could disagree about it.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's fast forward.
It's like a free rider kind of concept.
Yeah, no, it is. Absolutely. Right? The stupidity of the U.S. medical care system subsidizes the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to come to January 2020. This virus, this pandemic is starting to gather attention around the world. People are starting to get uneasy about it. People are starting to pay attention to it. And in the first week or so of January 2020, the genetic makeup of the virus is first leaked and then publicly put forward by Chinese scientists. They've sequenced it and it's published. And the most incredible thing, I think, in human history, you could argue this is one of the most extraordinary, a little bit of hyperbole there, but it is one of the most extraordinary achievements, I think, of the human mind. First, that's an amazing thing to see. I don't even know what I can say the words, but to publish the genetic sequence, I can say those words, but that's an enormous scientific achievement of humanity. So they sequence the virus and they revealed the sequence, the genetics of it. And within maybe hours, certainly days, not more than days, not weeks, not months, not years, there is a proposed mRNA tool to fight it that comes out of both BioNTech and Moderna. And the world at that, I remember very vividly. Oh, we won't get a vaccine for years. We're going to have to live with this. Then people said, oh, I guess, if we had this incredible effort, maybe in 18 months. They had a vaccine in a weekend. Now, they had to produce it for better or for worse, they had to show that it was safe. I think we were way too cautious in putting it out. I think it cost thousands of lives. Certainly ex post, it cost thousands of lives. You could have argued it was a time to be a bit of a risk taker given what the world was going through. But within a weekend, they developed the science of the vaccine. How is that possible, given that they'd spent decades failing at other vaccines, and then that weekend's worth of work, produced a vaccine that was remarkably safe in the case of mRNA and remarkably effective? What was it? Because it's a well-known thing, the coronavirus. Why did it work so well? Should it have? Was that just good fortune? And they knew they had it, by the way. And they developed more than one. They had a dozen different variations they could try, and if they wanted. But a lot of it probably would have been fine. Of those dozen, what happened there?
Yeah, you raised a lot of interesting points. I hope I remember to address them all. I'll try my best. So yeah, listen, we're too close to it, I think, right now to appreciate the enormity of this scientific achievement. It goes down in history as one of the greatest. And yes, you say they released. It was one, Dr. Zhang, I read about it in my book, one researcher in China risking his career, his life maybe. He was under lots of pressure. He was torn what to do. He shared it with a guy named Eddie Holmes, an Australian a researcher.
Co-author.
Colleague, yeah, and he shared the genetic sequence of this virus. He didn't have to. The Chinese didn't want him to at the time. I'm not going to get into the whole politics of it, but he risked so much. We have him so much to thank. And yes, the Chinese subsequently did share the sequence of the genetic sequence of the virus. But would they have if it hadn't been leaked already? I doubt it, or I'm skeptical, I should say. Who knows? Who knows?
It's important to note that at this point in the virus, and still today, the Chinese government has been less than forthcoming about the origins, about the willingness, transparency to it. They have, and certainly then in January of 2020, they were trying to sweep it under the rug. It does seem like the last thing they wanted to do was to publish the genetic sequence.
Yes. And I'm not saying so to suggest that they created the virus in any way or that it even leaked, but yes, they were
we don't
dragging. Yes, they were dragging their feet in terms of being transparent. They were not transparent about it for sure. And just to remind the audience about January 2020, yeah, I was pretty blasé too. I was pretty complacent. I figured, yeah, don't these things peter out? Remember that earlier coronavirus? Yeah. Remember SARS, MERS, Zika? Yeah, they're lethal. They're threatening for a while, and maybe it kills a few people, but then it stops being threatening. It stops spreading. So, and I can get into why this one was different. But the researchers, to your point, the researchers within these companies were freaking out, and it was such a fascinating contrast. I was literally flying. I was in Heathrow airport, and my kids were wearing masks, these makeshift masks, and people were looking at us, and I didn't wear one. I was a little self-conscious. People were like thinking we were spreading something. So most of us in the world were a little bit blasé about it. But the people within these companies, Stefan Bancel was on vacation in January. He starts reading about this virus, and he's like, guys, this is our chance. This is our opportunity to prove our approach works. Sahin within BioNTech, Ugur Sahin, he reads the paper in Lancet about this new virus, and he starts going crazy. He's a cancer researcher, but he shifts gears. He's not really an infectious disease expert, but he and his wife, Aslam Turki, they're cancer researchers, and they had developed this approach using mRNA. And they're like, we're getting worried here. We're getting scared even. And why? Because the key part was that there was asymptomatic spread of this virus. There was a Lancet paper that showed there was asymptomatic spread, which was the key for why the earlier pathogens, coronaviruses didn't spread, is because you could isolate people. But when there's asymptomatic spread, you can't isolate people, and we're done. So they were getting scared while we were all kind of ignoring the dangers here. So to your question, okay, so then, why was it so effective? Listen, even within the labs, the executive boardrooms, et cetera, that these companies that I write about, they weren't sure. They were optimistic. They thought maybe they'd have a vaccine, even come November. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but November 2020, when the data came out for both BioNTech and Pfizer's vaccine, as well as the Moderna one, they went into those meetings with the FDA thinking they'd probably get about 70, 75% effectiveness. They're hoping for 70, 75% effectiveness. So even they had no idea that it would be this effective. And as to the question of why, on a relative basis, frankly, this coronavirus is not that complicated relative, obviously, to AIDS. I mean, HIV is different within each person. It commandeers the immune system. It's ever changing. Not so with this coronavirus. And, now I'm really jumping ahead, but even with the variants, the original vaccines are still pretty darn effective, which is surprising. They've developed new vaccines to potentially be distributed to take on based on the sequence of these new variants, but they haven't needed to use them so far. So I think to your question, part of the reason is this coronavirus is actually not all that complicated. And there was a fascinating contrast. So yeah, in January 2020, all the people I write about in my book are freaking out and they're scared. And some of them go home and they're buying toilet paper and tissues and a third refrigerator. If you remember that individual at Moderna, and when we're all complacent. But by April or so, or March, but certainly April, when the rest of us were starting to get really just plain scared within these companies and in the scientific labs as well, the academics, they're pretty confident. They're pretty optimistic. There's such a fascinating dichotomy where they have early data. It's not overwhelmingly persuasive, but it's pretty convincing that be it in animals or early humans subsequently, that this will be effective, that these vaccine approaches, all based on the coronavirus, they have a good likelihood of success.
Now it comes back to your description of the mRNA technique. They're pretty confident they could introduce that protein into the body. They weren't maybe so sure about what was going to happen next, how quickly it would respond, whether the case would decay appropriately or get into the start with. But I think the key is that science was well understood. The rest of it, the body itself, the shell, the case, is a little more complicated. But that part they were confident about, and then it was just a question of whether this mechanism would work the way they understood it to work, and it did. And,
yes. And the key is that there was literally decades of work on these approaches that you and I weren't aware. I speak for myself. I wasn't aware of. Most people, even within the world of science, people had dismissed this work for decades. But they were making progress. And it was kind of like I don't know what the analogy is. The specialists were like, guys, we're making progress here. Believe us. And everyone else is like, yeah, right. Tell us when you've actually had something approved here. But they were right and we were wrong. The skeptics were wrong.
But part of that, just to clarify a little detail, some of those vaccines that had failed, it was not that the underlying idea had failed. They couldn't easily replicate that protein. And here they understood it very quickly. That must have been the problem, right? I assume. The reason those earlier vaccines had been so problematic that they were stuck in stage 1 or it didn't work, or in some of it made things worse, was because it was a more complicated delivery product, that protein.
That was part of it. It took years to develop the delivery. Yes, that mechanism, that approach, the specific chemicals, it took a while, and there were different breakthroughs along the way. It's also the case that there were breakthroughs, other kinds of structural breakthroughs, structural biologists that I write about in my book, who developed ways to stabilize this spike protein. You'll see in the book. So there were a series of small breakthroughs made along the way that some people were aware of, other people weren't. In hindsight, these people may win, Nobel Prizes, but back then no one really cared that much. Ways to get the mRNA for the immune system to recognize, not to fight it off. And there was a change of chemicals, and it seems simple in hindsight, but took years to achieve. So there were small breakthroughs made along the way that most people weren't aware of.
And again, not a spoiler, we get a vaccine. It's remarkably safe, the Moderna one and the BioNTech that Pfizer then ends up producing, correct, and distributing. Um, and I'm alive. I've got triple. I've got a cocktail. I've got 2 Modernas under my skin, and I picked up a Pfizer bonus trip booster here in Israel. I went down to my healthcare provider and I said, I have 2 Modernas, and they say, okay, we're giving you a Pfizer. And I said, am I going to drop dead from a reaction mixing a cocktail like that? And she said, no. And while I'm waiting for them to process me and give me the shot, I'm Googling frantically on my phone, cocktail, death, side effects. I kind of trusted the system a little bit, figured it was kind of the same. I had understood a little bit of the science, not much at that point, not as much after I read your book, but I knew it was a similar idea. So I felt I was in the same family, even if it didn't have the same brand name.
Yeah.
But it's a remarkable thing. I remember walking out of the first time I got the shot, thinking, I'm Superman now. I'm just gonna go everywhere. It's not true, of course. Both, in fact, I hadn't had the second one, and even if you have 2, you can still get it because it's not 100% effective. And then I got the booster, and I feel really good. And I don't know whether it saved my life or not, right? Because no way of knowing. But I'm pretty grateful for it. And the book's very moving because here are these people who have spent sometimes decades being mocked or laughed at or disbelieved. They haven't just been successful. They have saved maybe millions of lives. It's very powerful. It's an extraordinary moment that you capture in those encounters between these people who are celebrating with each other, with their families. It's not just, oh, I'm a success. I'm a success, and it's really a good thing.
Yeah, it's historic. It's remarkable. And frankly, they were aware of the consequences if they had failed, and it put pressure on them. And they realized if they could save lives, it'd be millions of lives. I don't know if you picked up on this at the end, but the people I talked to within companies like Moderna, they're all rich right now. Their stock has soared, but they're also psychologically damaged. And I was just struck by that and shaken almost, because instead of celebrating and being lauded, obviously many are appreciative, but you've also got people that they're protesters in front of Moderna, accusing them of doing bad things, all kinds of various things. Frankly, there've been articles which I think are unfair, which have accused them in terms of intellectual property, other kinds of things. But you've got anti-vaxxers. I went to visit their plant, their manufacturing plant, during the summer of 2020, and I kept getting lost. And it was confusing. And I was like, what kind of company doesn't have signs? There were barely any signs. And later they were saying, yeah, Greg, we took all those signs down because we were worried about anti-vaxxer type people. They're also worried about people lining up and trying to get vaccines ahead of time. So those are both sides of things, but that also reflects. So can you imagine giving of yourself, working literally, like you said, 24/7, to try to save lives and make your company success, all that motivation wrapped up together, and succeeding, and yet people pointing the finger at you. And also, frankly, a lot of those people feel they didn't do enough. They could have gone faster. They never, as you know from the book, they couldn't find a partner. They tried Merck. Merck wasn't interested. BioNTech found Pfizer. Moderna found no one. And they had to work that much harder. And they didn't produce as many. They've produced many shots all over around the world, but not as many as they would have liked. So they feel they could have saved more lives. So they're and they haven't had a rest. They've had to prepare for these variants. And, maybe I'm too close to these people. I've written about them over the past year or so. But I feel some empathy, and I feel appreciation too for their remarkable achievement.
And the other thing we haven't talked about with the mRNA technology is really, really important, which is traditionally vaccines were grown bizarrely, as a non-scientist, non-vaccine person, they were grown in eggs, which takes a while. And the ability to ramp up billions, hundreds of millions at least, or billions of doses was another enormous factor in this near miracle of innovation. which couldn't have been done with the traditional vaccine as fast, and more people would have died. But the point you make about the pressure, the idea that with every day, when there were delays in, say, the clinical trials, or every day meant more people are going to die. The names that are here, we don't need to name them here on our program on EconTalk. They're in your book. These are people like the two you mentioned from BioNTech. Say their names again.
Ugur Sahin and Aslam Turki, a couple who run the company.
They were Turkish immigrants to Germany who created the technology for BioNTech, which became Pfizer's vaccine. We have Stefan Bancel, Hoj, other heroes who work from Moderna. There's 20 other names. There's an honor roll, and then there's the person at Merck who's, I think, is it Hillerman?
Hillerman is Merck. Yes, exactly. He's the vaccinologist, one of maybe the most impressive in history. Yeah.
MMR, a whole bunch of things.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's a tragedy, not a tragedy, but it's a shame to me that he's not a hero. He is a hero. He's just not a known hero.
Yeah, Salk and Saban, everyone knows. Yeah.
Everybody knows them. And God bless them. Grateful for them. It's fantastic. But here are all these people who've done these unbelievable things under incredible pressure. And I mentioned this before. I'm just going to say it again because I think it's important. Here's the sentence that's going to come out of my mouth. The FDA delayed approval of various test kits that I think was a terrible mistake. We have episode with Paul Romer on that from long ago. He was an early champion of more testing, and I think he was right. It's a tragedy that wasn't done. And they had to go through the standard process that every drug, they did speed it up, I'm sure, but I said they, and I said the FDA, and I said the government. I could have. Who are those people? Why is it that we don't know the names of the panelists on the FDA maybe we do know the names, but it's interesting to me that journalists don't hold those people accountable. Maybe it's too hard. Maybe we shouldn't judge them, but I think it's remarkable that we know the people who succeeded and failed in these vaccines in the scientific community, but in the regulatory community, there's not so much accountability, and I think that's a shame.
So I'm not an expert on the test kits. Everything I understand is what you're saying. We messed that up, and there may be fault there.
No, Greg, not we, not you, not me.
The FDA.
Somebody, a person, an actual person made that call. And even right now, there are certain treatments for COVID and other things. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. This is not one of them. But the FDA people at the FDA, whatever their names are, tend to drag their feet out of fear of being blamed if it doesn't turn out right. And I understand that as a human impulse. It's not a good thing. I think we need a little more accountability. Sorry, go ahead.
So I'm going to make a counter argument, and it's not one I've put a ton of research into, so I may be wrong. like much of what I say are right. But I would argue that the FDA needed to be cautious. In hindsight, it would have been nice had they not been so cautious. Clearly, I agree. But at the time, it wasn't obvious that these were going to be so effective, A. And B, can you imagine if there was some unforeseen death or something along the way? The vaccine, we already have, 30% of the U.S. populace that's vaccine hesitant or worse. And there's already misinformation. I give speeches, and there's always someone in the audience or more than one pointing a finger at me and angry and just, it's disturbing. Sure. So
fair enough.
The counter argument is that even if the science suggested they could go faster, even if there was a 10% chance of something bad happening, an unforeseen event, what that would have done to confidence. I mean, think back in 2020, you had Biden raising questions about the vaccines. You had Trump trying to rush the vaccines.
Incredibly optimistic. One of the times he turned out to be right. And do you give Operation Warp Speed, the government Trump, whatever you want to call it, decision to guarantee some sales for these companies, was it important?
I give Operation Warp Speed a ton of credit. I think it gets more credit than it deserves in some circles, and less credit than it deserves in other circles. So Operation Warp Speed, we made a brilliant decision they had a portfolio approach. They made a bet on 6 different vaccines, 2 mRNA ones, they both worked, 2 adenovirus ones, the J&J and the AstraZeneca worked. Both worked as well. AstraZeneca, we don't need the Oxford one. We don't need the US and elsewhere, but it worked. And then 2 protein subunit approaches, Novavax, which looks really good right now as we speak, and I think will be very helpful and elsewhere in the world. And then another one, which isn't there yet. We don't really need it. But 5 out of 6 is pretty darn good. And they wrote huge, big checks. And it's really, really important for people to understand that why was it so fast? Why was it in 330 days from the sequence to an authorized vaccine, which is just a joke. It's crazy how fast it was. Well, the key was obviously the years of research that went into these approaches that I write about, but it was also the fact that they could do things for the first time ever simultaneously, develop, test, and manufacture these vaccines. And never was done before. And why were they able to? Why would you manufacture a vaccine before it's approved? It's not in anyone's interest. It's billions of dollars. Well, because there was money available. And that was from Wall Street. We have to give Wall Street credit. And we have to give Operation Warp Speed credit because they wrote these big checks. And they said, don't worry about the consequences. Here we go. We're going to buy these vaccines ahead of time. And here's the money you need. So it was crucial money. It's just that there were also, I write about it sometimes in the book, where there were times when it's a bureaucracy like any other. It did slow the process down sometimes. So Moderna was in the lead as of like the summer of 2020. And then it had to slow its process due to Warp Speed, because there were certain requests that some people at Warp Speed wanted them to do. In the end, it was just a waste of time. But what are you going to do? It sent them back 2 weeks, and that did cost lives. But Operation Warp Speed, we need to be very appreciative of that too.
To be clear, I'm not a particular fan of government subsidies to healthcare, as should be clear, but it's to offset the fact that there's going to be an enormous political pressure to nationalize anything that's discovered. There still is pressure on it, and to not allow these companies to profit. And if that's there, what Operation Warp Speed did for me is to offset that fear and create the opportunity for investment. That's true. But let me say one more thing about the FDA to be clear. I take your point about the mood and the fear and the anxiety about side effects, and there have been some side effects, and people have reacted. I think they've overreacted to it, given the risk of the virus. The only point I would make is that I think the rules ex ante is always different than ex post. Ex post, we're very lucky, we could call it, or the science was great, the side effects were small. So I don't want to say they were overly cautious because it turns out they were safe. They might not have been safe, and they couldn't know that in advance. They might have known something about it, but again, a lot of that would have come from inside claims, and who knows if they were true. I just think that when hundreds of thousands of people, and the death count in the United States will tragically start to approach 1 million soon. We're at 800 plus thousand right now on December of 20. Yeah. I think there are times when you want to change your risk assessment and take some chances that you wouldn't take in a different situation. Now, in a democracy, maybe that's too hard to do. Maybe the public won't react negatively to that. A side issue, which you're welcome to comment on, is that I think the public health community, especially within the government, has been incredibly destructive of people's ability to make intelligent decisions because of the conflicting signals that they've given, and the fact that they have, as far as I can tell, misled people about the situation in the name of, quote, their own good. So I think we have to be, I think it's interesting to think about what our norms should be as a democracy for how we communicate these risks to a free people. And we didn't get this right. I can't even say that without literally laughing out loud. It's tragic. It's dark. It's not funny. It's tragic. And I'm not optimistic that we'll do better in the future. What are your thoughts?
So I agree with what you're saying. There were tons of mistakes made. I am more sympathetic to those who had to make these decisions in real time.
It's brutal. I agree.
Yeah, and listen, let's talk about Fauci for example. Obviously, he's lauded in some circles, and vilified in others. He made mistakes, early mistakes. He's made mistakes along the way. When you talk about misleading, he misled the public. He said that masks aren't effective. Now, who wants a public official misleading people? I feel he's been unfairly criticized because at the time he was worried that the health system would be overwhelmed. And if he said, everyone go get a mask, he knew that we had to prepare for this thing and there weren't enough masks. And the healthcare workers, the essential healthcare workers, unlike Greg Zuckerman sitting in his basement in New Jersey, suburban New Jersey, who would have gone right on Amazon and ordered some masks, I would have been competing with the essential workers. So I understand that instinct, that impulse. And I'm not saying, I try not, I don't want to judge. And also, frankly, we have to give Fauci and others credit for betting on mRNA. They made a bet. They got mRNA years ago and were working with Moderna, advancing the science. And I would argue that BioNTech in some ways are fast followers and they didn't develop a lot of that stuff. They did on their own, but they were reading some of the papers that Moderna wrote, and that's my instinct anyway. So we have to give Fauci and company credit as well as criticism.
The only thing I'll say is, and I accept your point that it's easy to be a sideline Monday morning, quarterback, a critic of ex post of everybody makes mistakes. I think regardless of his character, his personal responsibility, I think it's an incredible mistake and tragedy when a person representing authority deliberately tells something that isn't true. I understand the motivation. I would have found a different way. I would have let the price of masks rise, and I would have encouraged people to make a lot of money for masks. But that's me, and that might have had its own negative consequences. Instead, we said, if you raise your price for masks, we're going to arrest you and we're going to treat you as a price gouger. And as a result, we had to tell people that masks, because then there was going to be a shortage. So we had to tell people that masks didn't work. Someone had to say that, not we. Anthony Fauci and others had to say it, with the result that the faith people had in the scientific community got degraded. And I think that's part of the problem we're in today. But I take your point. I don't think it's not easy to sit in that chair. It's easy to sit in this chair, either in your basement in New Jersey or in my office here in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem. Do you have any, well, let's close on this. Do you have any idea of, have you heard any number? I don't remember them in your book. How many lives were saved? What if we had no vaccine? What if this disease had just spread the way, we could have responded in different ways if we hadn't had the vaccine. We could have locked down more, quarantined more, spent more money. Who knows? There's 1,000 ways to think about this, of course. But I do feel like it has saved many, many lives.
Yeah, there's a study I cite early, I think in the introduction of my book. It's a Yale study. And I think at the time, it was as of the summer of 2020, late summer, I think. And it was close to 1 million lives, I think. And obviously it's more today. And also it's important to remember, and I don't know if I didn't dig into the how they came up with these figures, but it's also important to remember that what we did with these vaccines was stabilize the healthcare system. And as a result, we had other kinds of illnesses and diseases that could be treated. And as a result, people were saved. So it's hard to get an exact figure. And you ask about what would have happened had we let this thing go, like with the flu and obviously in other pandemics. We would have maybe achieved herd immunity earlier, but it would have overwhelmed the healthcare system, is my understanding from talking to people who worked in it. And that obviously would have been just devastating. So for everybody who says, it's not that much worse than the flu, there's the death and there's other kinds of diseases, but there's also the issue of long COVID, which I don't think gets enough focus. And, I guess it's anecdotal. And here I am, a journalist doing the whole talking to a cabbie kind of thing. But I know people that are suffering from long COVID, and it's nothing you wish on anyone. And a foggy brain and lethargy lasting over a year, and pain sometimes. And there's that's been prevented as well. So in addition to the death and the hospitalization.
Well, I have to add that it's not just, we don't just care about life and death. I've said it many times on the program. The ability to, again, I'm just, joking about feeling like Superman. That feeling passed very quickly after my first dose, but it did feel for about half an hour. And that's because, I went inside a building without fear. That's what I really mean by I felt like Superman. There was a period that, in the early days of the pandemic, I go to the grocery and I'm anxious the whole time. I'm wiping down the handle of my cart. I'm wearing, artificial gloves, and I'm pushing the cart. I'm upset when the cashier picks up one of my items, and there were some crazy moments in the early days of the pandemic, and they still persist. I don't judge anyone. We all have our own weird neuroses about this, and fear and paranoia and things we'll do that other people won't do, and vice versa. And we look at the other person and go, well, that's crazy. But then you realize, wait, no, I do that crazy thing too. And I'm grateful that I'm able to sit in an office with my colleagues without a mask on, I don't huddle with them and whisper into their ear, but I do sit face to face without a mask. And I'm not sure how much masks work with Omicron, and certainly I'm not sure about the kind of masks that I'm wearing and that people around me are wearing, these paper masks. I think there is some theater or placebo effect working there to fool us. But my point is that the vaccine has allowed some normalcy in life that is worth an enormous amount. It's not just that I haven't died from COVID. I've got to enjoy my family. I've got to enjoy my friends, and I've got to enjoy my colleagues. And I don't think it's hard to put a value on that, but it's very high.
And as you know from reading the book, what jumped out at me is just how lucky and fortunate we are, and how appreciative we need to be that this virus emerged in late 2019 and not late 2016 or 2017, maybe. We weren't ready then. So I talk to scientists, I talk to these researchers, they say it might have been years before a vaccine could be introduced, not 330 days. So can you imagine, as appreciative as we are that a vaccine was developed so quickly, we need to also be appreciative just how lucky we are that this virus emerged when it did.
Yeah. My guest today has been Greg Zuckerman. His book is A Shot to Save the World. Greg, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Great to be here, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.